Everyone. Shelly and I are really excited to present today to take you kind of from principles to practice to really talk about a community-based participatory research approach by, with, and for women living with BC. Before we start, I want to honor the lands, waters, and peoples. So we're going to talk a lot about the BCC3 study, which takes place across British Columbia on the traditional territories of many First Nations peoples. And we're grateful for those kind of across these lands who have stewarded them since time immemorial. And just to note that most of our team is actually based in Vancouver on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish nations. So that includes the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And really our work in the HIV space is tied with colonialism, as the legacy and ongoing harms mean that Indigenous women are disproportionately impacted by HIV. And I add this as like a reminder, but also an affirmation for us to stand alongside our Indigenous sisters. So before we get started, we're going to do a little bit of like positionality, like who are we, how do we come to this work? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides as well, why we're doing that. But so my name is Zoe, and I just want to share some of my personal background so you know a little bit about me as we move through this space. But I grew up in a small town near Calgary, Alberta, and came from a white middle-class left-leaning family in a very conservative province. I'm an auntie to this little munchkin there, a very important part of my life. And I'm also neurodivergent, I'm queer, I'm polyamorous, and I'm not living with HIV. So I'm coming to this space always trying to act as an ally. As terms of my academic background, so I started in molecular cellular biology, but quickly moved more towards the public health side. And I've really been working in the HIV space since 2015. As I mentioned, I'm here on Coast Salish territories, and I come to this work as a community-based research coordinator, and I work across multiple studies, so qualitative, quantitative, working with women living with HIV, working with queer and trans youth, and I'm really, like, my heart in this work is like the science of how we do community-based participatory research in a good way. Like, how do we really make sure that we're actually applying those principles and like bringing it from just a theory into reality and the complexities of that. And now I'm going to pass to Shelly to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Zoe. I come to this space, and my name is Shelly, and I come to this space living with HIV since 2008. And I am a community research associate with the BCC3 study. I'm also involved in an active member on other multiple HIV-related committees across Canada. I grew up in over 20 plus, I think my mom counted, she could move a house in 24 hours. 20 plus towns and cities and provinces across Canada, and a few years in the United States. I came from a white, lower middle class, liberal leaning family with 3 siblings and very many dogs. We had very, very many dogs throughout my childhood. And then I'm predominantly was a single mother of 2 extraordinary daughters and 1 kindred spirited granddaughter who has taken up my passion for gardening. And that's her pushing me on the swing, that gorgeous swing down in Richmond. And yeah, I have a joint degree academically in kinesiology and fine arts in dance. And as Logan highlighted, I've been working and volunteering in the HIV space since 2009. My primary passion, and has sort of driven my work over the years, has been my interest in equity and opportunity for persons living with HIV to be at the tables that they inform. And now I'm going to pass it back to Zoe to talk about further grounding our positionality.
Yeah, and so many of you might be familiar with this practice of positionality, but I wanted to just highlight why it's so important before we dive into the presentation. Because when we move in this space, we really need to be aware of the places where we hold privilege and power. And this awareness is important in thinking about how we move in this space, right? And so we need to take like an intersectional lens, because as you can see, as Shelly and I maybe highlighted a bit, is that there are many different parts of our identity who make up who we are. And so we're all holding both these places where we have more privilege or less privilege, and they kind of shape who we are. And so as you can see, like For instance, we both talked about, I mean, it's really important when we're thinking about these conversations, anti-repression is going to come up, that both of us are kind of closer to the middle of the wheel of power in terms of like, we're both white, we both have post-secondary education, things like that. But there are other places that our identities intersect. And so we're all kind of coming to this place with these overlapping identities who make us who we are. And so none of us are unaffected by these systems of oppression. And it's important to orient ourselves not as coming into any space as like helping a marginalized group, but we're all coming into this work as a team working in solidarity against these systems of inequality and oppression. And we thought that was important to mention before we get into this work as like grounding work before you do community-based participatory research. So the problem that we're going to talk about today is that historically, research honestly doesn't have a great track record, especially when working with marginalized community. And many research approaches, have been and continue to be extractive, re-traumatizing, and draining on community members, while offering really little or no tangible benefit to the community. And this is something here in Vancouver that we see in the downtown east side a lot. And I borrowed a quote from the Manifest for Ethical Research saying, research can increase inequality, contribute to stigma, exploit people's pain, exhaust community members, and typically benefits researchers much more than it does than it benefits the downtown east side. And so today we'll talk about a potential solution and really practically how it might be applied. So as researchers, we have the responsibility to figure out how to maximize the benefit of research to community while also minimizing the harm that we may cause. And community-based participatory research and its principles are one such way. So first we'll do a little introduction, and I'm sure many of the people I can see here are familiar with community-based participatory action or participatory research. So I'll do an overview. Forgive me if it's something you already know, but just important to ground the work we do. And then we're going to talk about like what this can look like in practice and talk through some of the principles that I'll share and how we try to embody them and highlight even where some of the places that we know we need to do better are. So what is community-based participatory research? At the most basic level, I understand it as research that involves those impacted as equal partners throughout the process. And I've shared a couple of similar terms here because oftentimes they're used interchangeably, though they all have kind of their own frameworks and principles. But just so you're familiar, like community engaged research, participatory action research, patient-oriented research, action research, all of these are very similar in their goal to engage community throughout the process. And I just wanted to highlight that as something, a terminology thing that might come up as people move through these spaces. So I have, I think, 9 principles that we're going to touch on. And I'm going to describe them in kind of here, overview. And then later in the second half, we're going to get into a few of them and actually exploring what that looks like. So these are principles that I've synthesized. This is like kind of my interpretation from the multiple sources that I've pulled from. It's not like an official, this is community-based participatory research. This is Zoe's version. So the first is centering relationships. And so that really means like investing time and resources into building these trusting research relationships and really rooting that work in transparency and open avenues of communication. The second is collaboration across the research processes. So that means integrating community from, deciding research aims all the way through data collection, analysis, knowledge mobilization, all pieces of the research. Prioritizing the safety of community. So not only just protecting privacy and confidentiality of community, but also being thoughtful about the processes of the research and avoiding doing harm. So avoiding questions that are re-traumatizing or ensuring that folks have supports if they do experience harm. And this also means protecting those that are part of our research team engaged in the research and making sure they are also safe. It's really using approaches based in anti-oppression principles, disruption of power imbalances and equity. I've kind of like put these together because they're all interrelated. But some of the things in that space is, really reflecting and recognizing the power differentials inherent in this community and researcher relationship. And some of that work is, doing the reflection that we did at the top, but it's really about unpacking that too. And so trying to create spaces where decision-making is shared, community members have leadership roles. And then another important piece is really centering the margins. So ensuring that, when you are bringing voices in, it's not just folks who have kind of the most dominant experience, but you're making sure that folks are not only invited, but are supported to participate, who kind of have these broader experiences. Another important one is co-learnings. That's investing in building the capacity of all research team members and really creating this bi-directional relationships where it's not, the researcher is coming in to like teach, but it's that both community members and researchers have the opportunity to act as trainers. And then just 4 final ones. So one is an integration of a strengths-based approach. So we know, in health research, we are often focused on deficits, and really a focus of community-based research is highlighting and building upon community strengths and resources that already exist. Knowledge mobilization is so important. And this really, to me, this is like one of the most crucial ones, is that we're not doing research for research's sake. We're doing research to mobilize action, and it must be moved to action. And this means not just sharing, your research papers and your conferences, but really making sure that knowledge mobilization is done with community members. And we're definitely going to spend some time talking about this one. And then a social and ecological determinants of health approach is another important part of community-based research. So that's really an understanding that health and disease are not influenced just by these biomedical and individual factors, but also our environments and contexts, the social, the political, the cultural, the historical, the economic, all of that helps shape our experiences of health. And then finally, this is the last one of my spiel, is that it involves a cyclical and iterative process. So understanding that this community engaged work is ongoing, and that you're going to have to come back to it and rethink and reinvest as you go through the cycle of research, and working with your own team. So my final slide on the background before we get into kind of the application is another thing that I think is important to highlight is that sometimes people are like, oh yeah, it's just like researchers and community members coming together. And I kind of conceptualize it as at least, I mean, sometimes more groups than this, but at least these 3 different groups coming together. And it's important to talk about who is involved. And so because we all kind of are bringing our own needs and mandates to this work, and strengths as well. And so we have, community members who are bringing their own expertise and their living experience, their community's needs, their own backgrounds and other history and expertise. And they have their own priorities based on, what they need, what their community needs, and their specific contexts. You have community-based organizations, and they're really going to be bringing expertise in program planning and implementation. And also, as they are like the front line for many folks, community needs as well. But at the same time, they are mandated to provide the services that they are funded to do for community members. And so that means that there might sometimes be tension in what they have the capacity to do when it comes to research as well. Academic researchers, so we're really bringing our expertise in these research processes and theoretical frameworks and those kind of pieces. But we are mandated at the same time to produce peer-reviewed manuscripts, to present at conferences, to secure grants, to adhere to ethics requirements. And so we also have these kind of restrictions in kind of how we show up in this work. And so I think this is important to talk about, that you need to, it's a balancing act where you're trying to meet everyone's needs at the same time while working in partnership, which can be a complicated part of the research process. And now, I feel like the exciting part. So I'm going to pass to Shelly, who's going to talk a little bit more about practical examples.
Thanks, Zoe. So what does community-based participatory research look like in practice? So just for some clarity, obviously there is not a universal practice or standard, if you will, of what community-based participatory research looks like in practice, but rather that what we're presenting here today is an example of what we've been doing with the BCC3 study and the ways we have integrated some of the principles that Zoe has just outlined into practice. An important note is that what works, for example, in Metro Vancouver may not work in the north or on the island or in the interior. And so that it's really crucial that foundationally it is driven by, with, and for the community it serves, particularly when it comes to things like recruitment drives or knowledge mobilization. And we'll talk about that further along in the presentation. So just for a brief background on BCC3 to get this started, I know many of you on this Zoom have maybe heard enough about us already, but just a brief overview, if you will. So some background on the study. So the overall study aim, first of all, it's the British Columbia CARMA-CHIWOS Collaboration. And there's a QR code there that you can feel free to scan and gives you links to resources on our website and more broader overview or more specific overview. But the overall study aim is using a cell to society approach to understand healthy aging in women living with HIV, the impacts of chronic and latent viral infections, hormones and reproductive health, physical, mental, sexual health, psychosocial, behavioral, and structural determinants of health. So the design is a 5-year women-centered community and clinic-based project, bringing together women living with HIV, researchers, clinicians, and community partners in British Columbia. And the study itself comprises of 2 visits, a clinical visit and the community survey. So the clinical visit is basically the initial contact, and that is done at Oak Tree Clinic in Vancouver, or when we're doing recruitment drives in alliance with whatever phlebotomists that we can find in that area that can help us get these specimens in a timely fashion flown back to the labs in Vancouver. A lot of details go into that, but primarily the visits are held at Oak Tree Clinic in Vancouver at Women and Children's Hospital, where they do the biospecimen collection, which includes measurements, hair, blood, optional anal, vaginal, and I think that's it, and measurements. And so during that visit, they'll take that information, those biospecimens, they'll do some demographics on the surveys, which includes things like vaccinations and viruses, medical and HIV care, medical history, reproductive health, and substance use. And then the follow-up visit is within 30 days after the clinical, and that's the community visit, which is administered by community research associates like myself, which is focused on demographics and social determinants of health, sleep and oral health, sexual health, stigma and discrimination, physical activity, chronic pain, violence and abuse, social support, emotional and social well-being and health, COVID-19, and resilience. So that's a lot, but this is kind of how it works in the broader concept. Sorry, I'm just gonna switch this up here. So first, at the first part is the Community Advisory Board. And at the very beginning of the study, we invited and recruited for our Community Advisory Board, which currently, as of our most recent CAB meeting on March 6, 2025, has over 50+ members with common interests from across the province, who are more at arm's length, if you will, including academic researchers, policymakers, clinicians, community workers, activists, and others in the field of HIV, women's health, and healthy aging. And they are welcome and actively encouraged to participate and engage in the meetings. And during the CAB meetings, which are annual, we present on sort of where we're at, what we've been doing, and sort of what have we been doing with your time and resources and energy that you've given us, and making sure that we're on track, and getting feedback, of course, is a main priority of the CAB. So they're basically guiding each stage of the research, and they advise on study approaches and priorities and support the knowledge mobilization. And then we have the community-based partners or organizations who are more involved in a sort of ad hoc approach, who advise versus guide on study approaches, support study recruitment, provide community perspectives on findings and knowledge mobilizations, and are really community partners. For example, the Afro-Canadian Positive Network of BC, Ribbon Community, and the Central Interior Native Health Society. These are active and ongoing partnerships we nurture and trust, or nurture and build upon on an ongoing basis. strengthening community ties and trust to ensure that we are listening to their voices and doing what we say we will do. And then finally, we have community research associates like myself who are self-identified women living with HIV, who share social identities and lived experience with the community of women living with HIV, and we are core members of the study team. So we conduct the community surveys, advise on study approaches, support data analysis, and then co-present and facilitate the knowledge mobilization events, bringing results and findings back to the community, which we'll talk about a little later on in the presentation. Now I'm going to pass it back to Zoe to talk a little bit more about some of the principles of CBPR that we have been focused on.
Yeah, so we've just highlighted a few because we know we won't have time to go through all of these in depth. So hopefully that background gives you a grounding on like how we've been doing this work and what we're actually doing. And then we're going to dive into these, I think it's five principles, a little bit more in depth to talk about. So the first one I wanted to touch on is the centering of relationships. And really this means that we're focused on supporting each other and connecting outside of our working roles, and that we like prioritize caring about each other's well-being. So you're not showing up and Shelly's just like my colleague. I also care about Shelly as a person, which is surprisingly not how it feels in every workplace. But really we try and build in lots of ways to connect as a team. So, part of every meeting, we have time to check in with each other. We also have monthly CRA check-in meetings. And a lot of that time is dedicated to checking in with each other, sharing successes, challenges, lessons learned, and spending time making sure that like we feel supported and okay. This also means that we try and center open avenues of communication. So, Shelly can reach out to me, she can reach out to the PIs can reach out to Shelly. We really try and keep those open, and, we try to be as transparent as possible. Obviously, this isn't perfect, but keeping that avenue to discussion open is so important. And one of the things that we're working on that I'll talk a little bit more about later is a comprehensive policy around compensation, as that's such an important part of building trust. And especially as the CRA roles are growing and evolving. And I just wanted to talk about some of the team building activities to highlight this. So we've tried to have every 2 years or so a team retreat out at Melanie Marie's cabin, which is so beautiful. We have holiday dinners or other social gatherings together. And the other thing that I just wanted to highlight is not just about the relationship within our team, but also our relationship with community at large. And as a team, trying to show up for community events that are important to the communities that we work with and are a part of. And so as a couple of examples, like, it's funny, I'm glad Ribbon is here today, because that was one of our examples, is that, when Ribbon Community launched their new branding, we were like, wow, this is so exciting and such an important step in our community. So like, let's go as a team and make sure to show up. Or they have a holiday grocery program that we try and volunteer for. Or if we just see events, you'll see on our like email thread, often us sending events to be like, oh, I want to go to this. Like, is anybody else going to Community's winter warm up, or other talks? So we really try and make sure that we're like sharing with each other, but also showing up together to these community events to show show the way that we care for community outside of just the parameters of our research relationship. And I'll pass to Shelly to talk about the next one.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks. So principles of CBR in action with BCC3. What does this look like? So as you can see in the slide on the lower left corner, with community at the center. So community at the center, but starting with from the very get-go, from beginning of 2020, we were part of determining the research questions. We were part of the survey design. And I don't mean like we had a meeting and we got to review it, we gave feedback. I mean, we had multiple meetings, multiple opportunities to look, reassess and assess how the questions were being written, where they were placed in the order of the survey, and how, again, at the center of that, with the intent of causing no further harm. We were also involved then in the data collection, as I mentioned, administering the surveys, the data analysis. This is very recent, where we're getting training now, thanks to some of the great team members we have. So we're learning about data analysis so that we can have the confidence to meaningfully contribute. And then, of course, we are at the center and the core of the knowledge mobilization efforts, bringing findings back to the community. So with that, I wanted to highlight a couple things on this slide. And one is that, for example, in terms of in the study design, so chronic pain was something that came directly from a very experienced woman living with HIV, living with chronic pain, who brought this suggestion to the team and said, you know, this would be a perfect opportunity to collect some data on chronic pain. And with that, it was put in motion, and that became part of our survey without hesitation. So that's direct involvement of community saying, hey, this is important to us. Why don't you look at this? Can you add this to your study? Which we did, and it has been extremely helpful and has spawned many papers and actually an organization. So it's been very exciting to see that evolve over time. And then also in terms of, again, exemplifying the bi-directional learning process that Zoe highlighted earlier, is that the CAB members on the Community Advisory Board have also been, and of course the community partners, have been involved in informing this work across the process, including knowledge mobilization, where we say, you know, how can we best partner with you to bring these results and make it good for your membership so that they feel like they want to participate, that they feel safe, that they want to join and come and learn. And so that's been, particularly with Ribbon Community, this has been a really excellent place where we've had incredible feedback from the women that have attended, always informing the next event, always informing the next, even the next presentation on the same event for things, successes, challenges, lessons learned. And then finally, I wanted to highlight Redose, which was another suggestion that came from community about antiretroviral level drug concentrations and side effects for individuals living with HIV. And so this is a very exciting project. I know for myself personally, I constantly was asking, why am I on the same meds as a 250-pound man? I'm 120 soaking wet. I don't get it. Why isn't my ARVs tailored to my body weight? And so this was a question that resonated exponentially throughout the community. All the women were like, yeah, I want to know that too. So to that end, we now have an extension of our study called the Redose study, which is looking at specifically Biktarvy, but looking at drug concentrations and levels over a 24-hour period. So this is super exciting, and it speaks volumes to how community can influence research. Community can be at the asking questions stage and involved from the very, very beginning. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that, and I'll pass it back to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Shelly. Okay, so I'm going to talk about using approaches based in anti-oppression principles, disruption of power imbalances, and equity. And obviously, this is a very big one. So there's many things I could talk about. So I'm going to try and highlight a few things. And just to start, this is an acknowledgement that this is a space that is not perfect, and we're always working on this. And, you know, there's many different power differentials. Like, for instance, we know our PIs are going to have a lot more power than, for instance, me and Shelly. But we're trying to make decisions as a team rather than unilaterally. So some of the ways that we do that is kind of more of a roundtable approach. So, you know, at our team meetings, first of all, our team meetings are very broad. It's like all the trainees, there's always a CRA representative, the PIs are present, and everyone has a chance to add items to the agenda, weigh in on the items. Another change that we made was CRA items are at the top of the agenda at our group check-ins. So we noticed that oftentimes the CRA priorities were getting bumped down to the end of the agenda and getting pushed to the next meeting. And, you know, the CRAs brought that and we're like, this is really not cool. And so we changed it. So now that's like the first item right after our check-in, like right after our land acknowledgement, is it's CRA items and other things, if we go over, get bumped to the next meeting. And so we really try and do collaborative decision making. So I did mention the compensation policy, and so that is important, that as the CRA roles have grown in the study and they're doing different types of activities than they were when they were hired. And it's really important that we're clear on our processes. And we, in transparency, have not always been, as the roles have changed. We don't always know exactly how we're doing it. And so we're working on co-developing this. And importantly, like, kind of the plan is that me and the CRAs are going to work on a proposal that we will bring to the PIs and propose what we think is fair, and then have discussion around what is feasible. So instead of the PIs being like, okay, we have decided this is what we're going to do, the plan is to start with us and be like, okay, like, let's see how we can, what we think is fair, and talk about that, and then have a group discussion to make sure that this is something that we come to together and transparently. And so that's kind of disrupting that power differential that's usually there, and seeing that it is still there, but there's things that we can do. And then one of the spaces that we're trying to do better in is around kind of the history of like colonial oppression, as well as Indigenous sovereignty. And so admittedly, like, our study has Indigenous team members, but it's not an Indigenous led study. And so we have many Indigenous participants from across different nations and backgrounds who are participating in our study, and we need to ensure that, you know, our study is responsive to that. And so far we've had one initial meeting with Indigenous women who are deeply engaged in research, but this work is really ongoing, and we're looking at kind of the logistics and possibility of developing some sort of like Indigenous research board that would help guide how data and specimens of Indigenous people in our study are handled, analyzed, and stored. And this is really an ongoing work that we're trying to be better in and improve on. And so there are like actually like so many more places that you can imagine that this comes up, this power differential and anti-oppression and equity. But I'm gonna leave it there just for the sake of time. But these are some spaces that I wanted to highlight in terms of like some reflection on what we're working on and where we're trying to do better. Because I think that's really important to know that, like, you don't have to be perfect to show up for this work, and that it is a process of trying to be better. And we continue to work through this. Like, I mean, as I said, the PIs still have final say over like funds, and they're beholden to different universities and funding bodies and are legally responsible for the money. So it is really hard to unpack this power that these institutions are imbuing, as well as our own power and privilege that we're bringing to the work by the nature of our intersecting identities. But it is something that we need to continue to do. We're doing our best on, and we have to continue to do our best and continue to work through. I think that's really important to highlight in terms of the ongoing nature of applying these principles, and the responsiveness in terms of responding to what we hear, and being like, oh, well, you're not doing that great in this area, and being able to continue to do that. So I'm going to pass to Shelly.
Thanks, Zoe. So in the interest of time, and I want us to get to some questions. So I'm going to really do this really quickly because a lot of people on this call already know. But so basically, along with the more traditional forms of knowledge mobilization, like papers and conference presentations, we make a real concentrated effort towards community-focused KM. So what that means in practice is that when we say, for example, we're doing what we started out with an arts-based series of talks, which are down in this photo down in the lower left corner, where this was, I believe, from a recruitment drive in Victoria. And women were, we were doing a recruitment drive for the study, but we were also doing a knowledge mobilization event at the same time with preliminary findings on chronic pain. And so it's a great opportunity when you're doing recruitment to do knowledge mobilization. Even if you have preliminary findings, we can open dialogue, we can open discussion, and we can hear from the community that we've zoomed in or landed in, literally. So with that, we also develop things like the the BCC3 Sharing and Learning Workshop Series, which was held at Loon Lake, and it involved 20 women, I believe, and 5 team members that came together for an overnight retreat in this beautiful location out by UBC and Mission. And we all just had an amazing 24 hours, 36 hours together, learning about HIV, sort of the social determinants of health and cellular aging. And it was just wonderful to have a getaway in person, especially post-pandemic. And then we also did things like, this is a picture here of me and Melanie presenting with Liz King. And so we have doctors that come in now to our knowledge mobilization events to answer direct questions from community that's specific to them, so that we can, so the doctor's presence, the doctors in the house, is real. And they really appreciate, women really appreciate the fact to talk to a doctor that's not theirs, and or maybe is theirs in that setting, and get some answers about clinical care. And then we do also Public Scholars Initiative here, this picture above, which was Voices of Health Equity at UBC. And so, yeah, there's that. And I'm just going to wrap this up by saying there's also the evaluation piece, which is ongoing. And so that evaluation piece, as I mentioned earlier, is always at the core of doing better next time. So every event that we do, we take that feedback from the women that are attending very seriously. We integrate what we can, and we adapt and go on to the next presentation, always building on what feedback we get, whether that's from membership, partnership, CAB members, whoever it is. We take feedback to heart. And I think I'll pass it back to you, Zoe, for the next slide.
Yes. Okay, so we're almost done. We're just wrapping up. This is the last principle that we'll talk about. But really, I think this ties together a lot of what we highlighted, is that it is a cyclical and iterative process. And so we've mentioned how we try and make changes as we go. And I want to highlight another piece of that, is that we're also trying to identify and plan ongoing training for our whole team, as well as respond to CRA requests for specific additional training. So we have a couple that we did all as a team, some EDI training, some trauma-informed research practice in research, which is in process. We attended a training, a few members attended a training on sexual and reproductive health among queer and trans folks, and brought it back for discussion with our team about, okay, so this is what we learned, and we want to know how that applies in our study, and think through how that applies in our study together. And then in terms of kind of more, so these next 3 are more CRA specific. So this training is really focused on ongoing training to deepen their engagement across the study. And so the last year has focused on data analysis, which came from our, as we've coined, our avalanche of abstracts, which happened at CAR 2 years ago, where the CRAs were absolutely bombarded with abstracts from trainees right before the deadline to submit to CAR, which happened because we had a policy to include CRAs, but it wasn't really being well executed. And so it ended up with all of these abstracts at the same time. And so, yes, we had to change our policy to make sure that it was being done in a better way to integrate throughout. But also we wanted to make sure that the CRAs had tools to feel confident in this role and contributing to this role. And so this last year has really focused on kind of quant data analysis. So we've done some intro to stats terminology, some descriptive statistics, and then talked about statistical significance. And that's kind of ongoing, tied into our meetings, that we keep coming back to those. You can see this center here is one of our slides where we're talking about the mean and like what that means and how you would calculate that. And then we also talked about like the anatomy of an abstract. So how to write an abstract and how to pull out information when you're reviewing somebody else's abstract. And then finally, I just want to highlight the lab tour because I think it's such a cool thing. So just an acknowledgement that many of the folks on the more social side of our research had never been in a lab or didn't know what happened to the specimens after we collected them. And so we were invited to take a tour of the lab, and you can see Melanie and Davi are 2 of our CRAs there, right in the mix of things. To be able to learn about what happens to a specimen after it's brought into the lab, and what does it look like, to be able to better understand the whole research process. And just to finish up, like this research cycle is ongoing. And so we continue to expand and add upon the study based on community priorities, not just redos, but sub-studies on menopause. We are applying to future grants, reassessing kind of what equity looks like in our study, and to obtain funds to expand our approach to be more inclusive and really guided by our CRAs, our community collaborators, our CAB. And that is it. I'm going to hand it over to Shelly just to close us off with some final considerations.
Thanks, Zoe. So I think it's important to end final considerations to talk about resiliency, even though it's not my favorite word in the world, but it's kind of overused these days. But people aren't necessarily going to agree. And there's mistakes happen. People have emotional reactions to different things, but we need to be able to hear what people are saying anyways. This tends to be where people struggle the most, calmly hearing the message rather than reacting emotionally. I know myself, I've been guilty of this many times. My passion comes further than my brain can put out the words. But we have to emphasize that this is the hardest part of this type of research because it can be scary. And because it's scary, that is where some of the best learning can come from. It's okay to make mistakes. We all do, but working through and past these challenges is so extremely important to this work. So as a team, we're always trying to assume the best in each other. Welcoming and responsive to feedback is so essential, and always looking for the main message regardless of the tone. So with that concludes our presentation for today, and we'd like to thank you all so much for listening. And we'd like to open up the space for discussion and questions. And I'll pass it back to Logan.